On Russia, this is a terribly sad thing for me, because I spent a lot of time in the 80s and early 90s on Russia. I'd go there every year. I'd spend weeks there. I traveled all over. I got to know most of the people who ran the government and who are now there. And I think that right now we're confronted with something that potentially could have been avoided. And the fundamental blunder that the United States made in the mid-'80s, late 80s, early 90s, was the expansion of NATO. I mean, here we'd won the Cold War. We'd won the Cold War. And you then had people saying, well, now what are we going to do with NATO? Oh, well, I don't know. It's a bureaucracy. It works. What are we going to do with it? And so then the idea of expanding NATO. And the problem with it is this. During the negotiation for the reunification of Germany, Gorbachev and Jim Baker says to Gorbachev, you know, in the treaty it says, you know, no NATO troops in what was then East Germany. In the discussions, and I had this conversation with Gorbachev last summer, he told me very directly, the conversation with Jim Baker, the question was, Baker saying, NATO, if you agree to reunification of Germany in NATO, NATO will not expand 1 inch further east, which is what I went to see Gorbachev to confirm, because I care so much about this. Is this true? Now, the interpretation on the American side, Scowcroft says, well, he misinterpreted. Baker, I haven't quite pinned down. But Gorbachev says very specifically, he said, if you expand 1 inch further, if you allow reunification, Germany and NATO, NATO will not expand 1 inch further east. And then Gorbachev told me, Kohl told him the same thing, which was new information, right? So the first Bush keeps his promise. Assume it's a promise. They talk about partnership for peace, and you know, Russians kind of like that idea. And then Clinton comes in. What's the early thing he does in his first term? He expands NATO. Why expand NATO? And I read, and I've been rereading because I've been thinking of writing something about this, 𝗕𝗿𝗚𝗏𝗪's article in Foreign Affairs about why expand NATO, and you read it and you say, huh, that's a reason? You know? And last summer again, I'm talking to a number of people that I've known for many years, 2 guys who ran for president in Russia in 1996 and 2000. And you know, one of them says to me, I'm out campaigning in the Urals. Somebody comes up to me and says, this is 96. Why are the Americans expanding NATO? Isn't that a military alliance? And they said, well, yeah, but it's a military alliance. And the guy said, the politician said, Russians might not be able to understand puts and calls, but they certainly understand tanks, right? And think of it this way. What would any politics 101, somebody who's a friend, supporter, goes bankrupt, what do? You call them up on the phone and say, you know, Joe, it's tough. I know things are going to be okay. You're going to be back. You know, you show them some respect. And what did we do? We kicked them when they were down. We expanded NATO. And in expanding NATO, created the issue that allows the authoritarianism that has returned to say it was justified. And I think that it was a blunder of monumental proportions. When I was at Oxford, I spent a lot of time on the origins of the Cold War. And, you know, I read all these documents, and, I mean, all of the documents. And it's, you know, the Russians were responsible, basically, you know. Here, it's unfortunate. It's a blunder of vision. And in the best of circumstances, it was bureaucratic inertia in NATO that people had to have a job. In the worst of circumstances, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy with certain people in the Clinton administration who were irredentist, East European types, who believe Russia will forever be the enemy, and therefore we got to protect against the time where they might once again be aggressive, thereby creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, what do you do with it now? Still talk. But if we had done that, and if we'd really done a strategic partnership, talking about common threats over the long term and what we can do together, because we knew ultimately Russia would be back. I mean, they did have oil even then. You know, imagine how Iran would be different today. Imagine how Central Asia would be different, you know. So you've got me at a kind of moment where my feelings about the Russian thing are extremely sad, because I think that we've created a problem that could have been easily avoided, and we've lost a partner that could have been enormously important over the long term, and in particular, you know, with regard to the issues that most threaten us today.
NATO expansion is not over for the Russians, it's a reality. NATO's sitting on its borders. It's not about future NATO expansion, it's about current. NATO expansion represents the following to Russia, and near this I will end. It represents a profoundly broken promise to Russia made by the first Bush, that in return for united Germany and NATO, NATO would not expand eastward. This is beyond any dispute. People say, well, they never signed a treaty. But a deal is a deal. The United States gives its word unless we're shysters. And if you don't get it in writing, we'll cheat you. We broke our word. And when both Putin and Medvedev say publicly to Madeleine Albright and others, we, Russia, feel deceived and betrayed, that's what they're talking about. So NATO represents, on the part of Russia, a lack of trust. You break your words to us. To what extent can we trust you? Secondly, it represents military encirclement. If you sit in the Kremlin and you look out at where NATO is and where they want to go, it's everywhere. It's everywhere on Russia's borders. But there's something even more profound that's a taboo in the United States. NATO expansion represents, for the Russians, American hypocrisy and a dual standard. And they see it this way, and I can't think of any way to deny their argument. The expansion of NATO is the expansion of the American sphere of influence. Plain and simple. Where NATO goes, our military force goes. Where NATO goes, our arms munitions go, because they have to buy American weapons. Where NATO goes, Western soldiers go who date their women. They bring along their habits and all the other things. It's clearly, undebatably, indisputably, an expansion of America's sphere of influence. So there has been a tremendous expansion of America's sphere of influence since the mid-1990s, right plunk on Russia's borders. All the while, every administration, American administration, saying to Russia, including the Obama administration, you cannot have a sphere of influence because that's old thinking. Well, I mean, the Russians may be cruel, but they're not stupid. In other words, what they say is, we can now have the biggest sphere of influence the world's ever seen, and you don't get any, not even on your own border. In fact, we're taking what used to be your traditional sphere of influence, along with the energy and all the rest. It's ours now. Again, this idea of a winner-take-all policy. This is the enormous resentment in Russia. The relationship will never become a stable cooperative relationship until we deal with this problem. Does it mean Russia's entitled to a sphere of influence? I don't want to speak for 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, but Jack thinks yes, depending on what you mean by sphere of influence. They can't occupy countries. We had a Monroe Doctrine. I don't know what that meant. But the point is that until this is worked out, the relationship will never truly be post-Cold War. The problem is it's taboo in America to talk about this issue of who has a sphere of influence, who's entitled to it. I think there are solutions, but you can't even get the question asked.
Say a bit more about NATO expansion because it's so important. NATO expansion took place in two tranches. The first one was in 1999. That's when you get Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary incorporated into NATO. The second big tranche was in 2004. And that's when the Baltic states, you can see Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania up top, Romania, Bulgaria, these are the light brown countries. That's the second tranche of NATO expansion. Now, the Soviets made it clear from the mid-1990s they were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion. But number one, they were too weak to do anything about it. And two, it didn't involve the states that were right on their border. I mean, there's no question, as you can see from the map, that Latvia and Estonia are on Russia's border, and Lithuania as well, if you want to include that little enclave between Poland and Lithuania. But the fact is, these were very small states. It was early in the game, and the Russians were willing to live with it. But then the big trouble starts. And it comes in the famous Bucharest summit, NATO's Bucharest summit in April 2008, where at the end of the summit, a declaration is issued which says, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. The Russians made this perfectly clear. This was unacceptable. Russia's deputy foreign minister said, Georgia's and Ukraine's membership in the alliance is a huge strategic mistake which will have most serious consequences for pan-European security. Putin himself said, Georgia and Ukraine becoming part of NATO is a direct threat to Russia. You all remember that there was a war between Russia and Georgia in August 2008? That war was a consequence of this, because the Georgians thought we were sending them a signal that they could get uppity with the Russians and we would back them because they were going to become part of NATO. That's not what happened. And you know what happened. The Russians clobbered the Georgians, and Georgia is in deep trouble today because it thought it could become part of NATO. So you want to remember that April 2008 summit, very important. That declaration, very important. And then what happens is you have a war.
Would you say, Mikhail Gorbachev, that now we are at a turning point of history again concerning the relationship between East and West?
Да.
Yes, unfortunately.
К сожалению. Беда в том, что та холодная война, которая длилась...
The really bad thing is that during the Cold War, which lasted 40 years, we created many things that we can't get out of our heads or out of our policies
Мы не
anymore.
освободимся от того, что произошло в наших головах, в нашей политике. Это...
I deplore this. It's not what the world needs today. People noticed after the Cold War that they could live and work together peacefully.
Были потушены конфликты,
Conflicts were held in check, armies were reduced, and defense budgets cut. Now the idea of a new war is being forced upon us. People who want a military build-up give the impression that the situation is alarming. Actually, they want us to get used to the idea of a new war, a third world war.
Vladimir Putin also made tests with new intercontinental ballistic weapons, and he announced new tests yet again. Do you think he's ready and willing to use them?
Putin is being provoked into upholding the arms race, or even into stoking it. It's unavoidable. Many countries have started buying arms. Cannons, weapons of mass destruction, and so on. The greatest danger of all is from a military-industrial complex.
Are you afraid that your personal political legacy is threatened, endangered?
Several months ago, I wrote to Putin and Obama, asking them not to allow the situation to escalate into war. Those that are pushing for this have to be restrained. I see how hard it is for Obama. He's considered a weak president, reluctant to make decisions. He doesn't decide in the way the military-industrial complex would like.
The West has increased sanctions now to find a solution in the conflict. What do you make of them?
We are a huge country. We have enough land and resources, and this is what we trade with. Now people are using sanctions to try to stop us trading, to make us angry, to try our patience and provoke our politicians.
Swiss Foreign Minister 𝗕𝗿𝗍𝗪, who chairs the OSCE this year, has been negotiating with Putin over the Ukraine conflict. At the same time, Switzerland has taken sides by partially supporting sanctions against Russia.
According to you, this is a contradiction in terms?
It's right to try to steer the world and its politics in another direction, to facilitate collaboration, meetings between people and exchanges of views, to solve problems. And there are many for young and old. Cultural problems, environmental problems, poverty. There are so many problems already, and yet we are being dragged into an arms race. I appeal to people to be careful.
Mikhail Gorbachev, спасибо. Thank you for talking to us.
That's very good. It also means that the congressmen are not, I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake.
И меня не убедят заявления, декларации самого такого респектабельного характера относительно того, что России нечего беспокоить.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about. That was abruptly suspended or terminated in 1990.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет все.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
Ну и другое, это что уже новая стратегия?
So my question is this a new strategy?
Говорят, нет. И оборвались в конце 91-го года.
I think it is
Вот если это будет продолжаться так, тогда все, о чем мы говорили, перечисляли, целый перечень проблем, их трудно будет решить.
I feel that if
начнем разыгрывать карты друг против друга.
I feel that if the same kind of games continue to be played, if one country plays some card against the other country, then all of those problems, all of those issues that we've been mentioning today will be very difficult to resolve. Glasnost, free elections, political pluralism, the problems of concern to you. If not, it'll be more difficult. Thank you.
Сегодня это внешнеполитический инструмент Соединенных Штатов. Там нет союзников, там есть только вассалы. Когда страна становится членом НАТО, ей уже очень трудно сопротивляться давлению со стороны такой крупной страны, лидера НАТО, как США. И там легко может появиться все, что угодно. И система противоракетной обороны, и новые базы, и, если потребуется, и новые ударные комплексы. А нам что делать?
I find it hard to believe what has happened in terms of American policy. I can't imagine anything more counter to American interests than what we have done in the last 2 years in the context of the Ukraine. And first of all, nobody in the high policy echelons of government would look at the Ukraine and decide to resume the Cold War without understanding the other matters that are at stake. The Ukraine is very important. We'll talk about it individually. But the Syrian war, 400,000 people dead, nations destroyed, in large measure due to a decision by the United States to invade the Middle East. And a war that cannot be resolved, certainly without a close work and attention with Russia. The United Nations. United Nations can't work without the United States and the Soviet and Russia working together as permanent members of the Security Council. And there's so many questions where working together would make such a difference. I think of what happened 2 summers ago when we were talking about the line in the sand, and everybody got excited that Obama wouldn't have the guts to keep his promise that if that line in the sand was crossed, we were really going to respond. Well, it was the way I recall it, that the Prime Minister of Britain went to the Parliament to ask for forces to help join the United States in response to the line in the sand, and the Parliament told him no, we don't participate. And the President of the United States sounded out to Congress there weren't 10% of the members of the Congress who wanted to go to war. So the idea came forth, and it wasn't just from Russia because there were American groups working on it too. Let's work together and get Syria to sign the treaty on weapons of mass destruction. There were only 5 countries that hadn't signed it. Syria was one. And that's what we did. But the Russians worked with us together to bring that accomplishment about. Not only did we get the agreement, we got Syria to destroy the inventory of weaponry that it had been involved in. And the other thing is the nuclear armory. Are we crazy? There's 2 countries in the world that are essentially equal with nuclear weapons. Russia is one of them. We have to work together, as my colleagues have said, to save the world from that rogue nation or even that rogue radical person who's going to be able to get to nuclear weapons in the next decade and perhaps use it. We must enforce the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We must work together to see to it that rogue nations do not get nuclear weapons. The destruction that's related to that is so colossal, so difficult to think about. Well, those 4 considerations, the Ukraine, Syria, the United Nations, nuclear weapons, you put those together and it's absolutely compelling that the United States and Russia work together as nations. I don't care if we're friends. I mean, if the president can't stand Putin's face, that's up to him. But his larger obligation as President of the United States is to get along in the context of these issues. Nobody's entitled to use their personal reactions to another international leader to the detriment of America, as we are now, in my judgment, facing. Someone said to me the other day, you know, there's no real sovereign wars extant in the world today. All the wars are civil wars. That's probably true, and they're much more difficult to deal with in many ways. And the one thing America at the very height of its power in the world today, capable of resisting any kind of aggression against it and defeating it. The United States, in my judgment, and I thought it was the president's objective, is to use its great power not to allow war to begin, but instead of that, to use its great power to bring these civil situations together where new social contracts can be discussed and written. Wars can't be won anymore. We've seen that in every conflict since the Second World War. Vietnam, Iraq, these wars can't be won. And understanding that, why would the United States want to resume a hostile, negative attitude that would, in fact, pour liquid oil on the fires of civil wars everywhere in the country? I always say when I'm speaking about Russia, I always like to give two numbers. Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Second World War lost 27 million lives. The United States lost 406,000. We take that we were the ones who made the war and the victory possible. But everybody seemed to forget Stalingrad and the extraordinary sacrifice of Russian lives and families. There's not a family in Russia today that isn't still deeply scarred by the cost of the war. And why would we want to turn on a country that had suffered as it had suffered, that had gone through perhaps the most decisive civil convulsion when the Soviet Union broke up into its various independent states, and then lost its patrimony to oligarchs whom we encouraged in the name of free enterprise? I mean, what Russia has gone through in the last 70 years perhaps is worth our at least thinking, if we've lost our ability to sympathize with that cost and that terrible destruction. Let's at least realize its reality. I think the United States has a clear obligation. Ukraine is entitled to its freedom and to its free decisions as to how it's going to be involved. And it should, if it chooses, become part of the European Union. An event, by the way, that I think is long a ways away under the best of circumstances, just giving the cost of what it is to keep the Ukraine alive. Yes, that is an objective that we sustain, we object, and we encourage. But there was a time, and Ambassador Matlock remembers it certainly, I've heard Mr. Gorbachev say it, where the United States, and in order to convince Russia and President Gorbachev to accept the possibility of the unification of Germany and to allow that unified Germany into NATO, the United States agreed that it would not allow NATO to be on the borders of Russia. A promise broken almost before it was made. And we have seen now the escalation of problems and forces as NATO seeking to find a mission that justifies its existence has become the centerpiece of this problem in the Ukraine. Whatever happened in the Ukraine 2 years ago, everybody made terrible mistakes. We certainly, the Russians certainly, the European Union certainly, the Ukrainians certainly. Our job now is to try to put that back together. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because the Ukraine is a very divided country, always on the edge of civil war. And our task is not to side with one group, and certainly not the extremes of that group, to the derogation of the possibilities of the future of the Ukraine. And I think we have to reconsider very deeply what is the mission of NATO. We are in this past week, we've announced billions of dollars of armaments that are going to be distributed to the NATO countries. Against what threat? Well, of course, they're defining the threat in only one terms. But I'm grateful to my friend Alfred Ross for giving me an article today saying that Russia will bring peace to Syria, and the person who is saying this is a German general who is a former chairman of the NATO Military Committee. In other words, this is a decision that has to be rethought. We have to use Finland as the ideal marker that we want to. Finland, which is as entitled to as much anger and distrust and fear of Russia as any other country, more than any other country. Finland is a member of the European Union, but it is not a member of NATO. And I have no doubt that the centerpiece of the forces in NATO, besides the involvement of the clandestine forces of the United States that caused the overthrow of a duly elected government, which seems to me nobody's concern anymore, that we should in fact reconsider what our position is with NATO and give Russia what it's entitled to in terms of the assurances that it is not an aggressive force. Because there are many things that are happening today where that could be the case. We are Americans in the midst of a presidential election where we've lost all capacity to speak reasonably. But we are still, our power and our force and our ideals are at stake here. And it seems to me that our greatest obligation, both to ourselves and to the world that we want to create and lead, is to find a way to work with Russia, not to resume the Cold War, which would be the mortgage on the president's legacy that he will forever regret, in my judgment, but to understand that our present obligation is to bring this discussion back to reality and rationality and end this process. Thank you.
For us, war is not inevitable. We do not believe that there are blind tides of history which sweep men one way or another. In our own time, we've seen brave men overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable and forces that seemed overwhelming. Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny. They can choose slavery or freedom, war or peace. I have no doubt which they will choose. The treaty we are signing here today is evidence of the path they will follow. If there is anything certain today, if there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
We will now proceed to the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. The treaty shall enter into force between the states which have ratified it as soon as the ratifications of the majority of the signatories, including the ratifications of Belgium, Canada, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States, have been deposited.